Sorry about that. Okay, cool. I seem to have lost where I was here in terms of the slides. What am I sharing? Okay, it's fine. It's not fine.
Shift F5.
Shift F.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
Which number one? Number one.
Okay. And
You
then
just have to go to your.
okay. It's final.
Yeah. Stick now.
As with all maths, that seems to lack relevance in our lives. I learned the bare minimum. That was necessary for me to pass the course. As for the life of me, I just couldn't get what the whole thing was all about. A few years later, I was still not satisfied with the idea of having left with just a bare minimum understanding of the course. So I turned to programming for help. I find programming to be a really powerful tool because it allows us to translate abstract ideas and concepts into something concrete that we can interact with. And it also transforms the process of exploring these ideas into a fun endeavor. It is one way of giving relevance to the seemingly abstract concepts that just don't seem relevant enough for us to want to spend our time trying to understand. So I decided to develop a program that makes use of Fourier analysis to draw some 2D images. I'm going to be visually explaining this concept of Fourier analysis, as well as demonstrating its applications in 2D drawings through this Java program that I wrote, inspired by the incredible work of sketch artists. It is my hope that after going through this presentation, I'll be able to take away some of that fear of mathematics, get you to fall in love with it, and get you curious enough to want to play around with it. There's a quote by Robin Williams, which I first heard in an artificial intelligence course by one of the best teachers I've ever had the pleasure of listening to, the late Professor Patrick Winston of MIT. He said, "Once you name something, you are conscious of it. You have power over it, you are in control, you own it." And what that meant to me is that the first step in really understanding something is knowing the meaning to and understanding the words that are used to describe it. But more important than the name is the concept behind the name. And that's what we should be focusing on when we really want to understand something. The key point that I'm trying to make is that the names we give to concepts are oftentimes scarier than the concepts they describe. And mathematics is rife with such complex named concepts that scare people away and have them not wanting to engage with it. But this does not just apply to the names we give to mathematical concepts, but to the mathematical equations, symbols, and expressions that most mathematical texts are full of. On some random day, I decided to search for the word mathematics on the internet. I crack open the image results, and this is what I was presented with. To be honest with you, all these symbols, equations, and expressions don't exactly scream welcome to mathematics. Similar to names, people look at these mathematical symbols, equations, and expressions, and they think because they don't understand what each of these represents, then it must be something that is too complicated for them to understand, and such couldn't be further from the truth. Let's take the equation x squared plus y squared equal to 2, for example. Now, if you would go around asking people what this equation described, which I won't do, but chances are most people will probably have a hard time explaining exactly what this equation described. And yet, this equation happens to describe one of the most common shapes in the world, which is a circle, a shape formed by joining points that are the same distance from some central position. A simple concept to understand. Now, if you were to go around asking people what this shape was, pretty sure that most people will be able to tell you that it's a circle, or at least I hope they would. So I'm going to try as much as possible to get you to see beyond the names, see beyond the equations, symbols, and expressions, and focus on understanding the concept. Fourier analysis already sounds like a complicated concept because, number one, it has the word Fourier in it, which very few, if any amongst us here, can say what it means. And number two, it has the word analysis in it, which already plants into our minds this idea that a detailed examination is required. And number three, it's related to mathematics somehow, which is already scary. So allow me to take away that fear by telling you that Fourier analysis is the analysis of complex waveforms expressed as a sum of trigonometric functions, the frequencies of which form a harmonic series. Maybe some of you got what Fourier analysis actually means after listening to that definition. But I'm sure that most of you still don't get what Fourier analysis actually means after listening to that. And unfortunately, this is one of the definitions that will come across on the internet if you were to search for what Fourier analysis means. But I can assure you that it's not as complicated as it sounds. But enough about that. I want you to think happy thoughts. I want you to think about a smoothie. This beverage that is made up of a variety of ingredients like fruits, vegetables, maybe some milk, yogurt, and the like. These ingredients are pureed until you get a smooth concoction that is totally different from the original ingredients that were used to make it. But even though the smoothie is now a totally different product from the original ingredients that were blended together, you still know that it's a sum of all those ingredients that were used to make it. Suppose somebody came and gave you a smoothie, but you didn't know the ingredients that were used to make that smoothie, and you wanted to make more of the exact same smoothie for yourself. How would you go about doing so? Well, if you had some sort of a machine that could take the smoothie that you have and identify the ingredients and quantity of each ingredient in that smoothie, then you could use that machine to get the recipe for the smoothie you have and then use that recipe to make more of the exact same smoothie. By now, you're probably wondering, what does a smoothie have to do with Fourier analysis? It all begins with this round egg in a square hole by the name of Joseph Fourier, who proposed this crazy idea that any function, no matter how complicated, can be synthesized just by adding some trigonometric functions together. In essence, he was saying that any general function that you can think of is actually made up of these smooth sinusoidal components, which we call trigonometric functions. Now, this idea was met with a lot of skepticism, even from well-respected mathematicians like Lagrange and Laplace. And who could blame them? Because who could, at the time, believe that these smooth sinusoidal components can be added together to form all kinds of functions with all kinds of bends and edges? Fast forward to today, this idea has a whole field of mathematics built around it, with a wide range of applications from image and pattern recognition to quantum physics and to stock markets. If you think about these general functions as the smoothest, and then you think about the simpler trigonometric functions as the ingredients that the smoothies are made of, then Fourier analysis is all about building this mathematical machine that can break down, that can be able to identify the right combination of trigonometric functions that can be added together to give you the original function you gave it. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that there was nothing too complicated in that definition to explain the word Fourier in it. And you were right to notice that, because Fourier is just the name of a person. And therefore, it has nothing to do with the actual concept we want to talk about. The word analysis comes from the fact that this is something that people have studied and continue to study to find different ways of representing general functions as a sum of trigonometric functions. And mathematics, well, that's just an area of knowledge, and it has nothing to do with how simple or complicated a concept within that area of knowledge is going to be. Now that we've broken down the name Fourier analysis and also know the meaning behind the name, we have power over it. We are conscious of it, we are in control, we own it, and we are now ready to build our own mathematical unsmoothing machine. Fourier analysis tells us that the two ingredients that all general functions are made of are the sine function and the cosine function. The equation that you see in green is the algebraic equation for a sine function, and the equation that you see in orange is the algebraic equation for a sine function. Below each of the algebraic equations are the graphical representation of the sine function and the cosine function, respectively. So, thinking of an image as some general function, we are going to use Fourier analysis to decompose that image into its sine and cosine ingredients, and then have the computer reconstruct the original image from the sine and cosine ingredients that it calculated, which is kind of what a sketch artist can be thought to be doing, looking at something physical and replicating that on a piece of paper or a canvas. Now, algebraic expressions, however compact, are usually scary and unintuitive to understand. This is an algebraic sum of trigonometric functions. And most of our traumatic experiences with maths come from expressions like this that take away the beauty in mathematical ideas and immediately take us back to that one day when we had to use 2 answer sheets to solve a single math problem. But today is not that day, because we won't be solving math problems like this. So let's shift our attention to graphical representations and their sums instead. These are the graphical representations of the 3 trigonometric functions that we saw earlier on in our algebraic sum expression. The purple graph is what their graphical sum looks like. We notice that in places where all the 3 individual graphs are positive, we get a spike in our sum graph. It's more positive. And in places where at least one of our 3 individual graphs is negative, we get a slight dip in our sum graph, because the negative graph takes from the positive sum of the other 2. And in places where all the 3 individual graphs are negative, our sum graph is also negative. So visually, the sum of trigonometric functions makes sense. And it just took one graph paper and some pretty colors to do so. What we have seen from this is that looking at something from a different perspective can sometimes give us a better insight into it. It can help us analyze it differently and potentially understand it better. So I want us to look at trigonometric functions from a third perspective before we actually get down to applying this idea of Fourier analysis to drawings. Let's think about a line which starts at the point x is equal to 0, y is equal to 0, and ends at the point x is equal to the cosine of 45 degrees, y is equal to the sine of 45 degrees. This line makes an angle of 45 degrees with the positive x-axis. But I must tell you now that there's nothing significant about this angle being 45 degrees. We call the point x equal to 0, y equal to 0, the origin, because that is where we start. And we call the point x is equal to cos of 45 degrees, y is equal to the sine of 45 degrees, the terminal point, because that is where we end. So let us also give a name to this line. I think vector sounds fancy and exotic enough. So we'll call this line a vector. We can decide to get this vector to rotate by changing the angle that it makes with the positive x-axis from the constant 45 degrees to a variable or a quantity whose value changes. When we do that, we get a rotating vector like this one, which we call a phasor. That is just to differentiate it from the static vector that we saw previously. Now, If we trace the path made by the terminal point of the phasor as it rotates, we obviously get a circular path like that. And if we attach some horizontal cursor to the terminal point of the phasor as it rotates, we notice that this horizontal cursor just moves up and down as the phasor rotates. If we decide to plot the y values of the terminal point of the phasor over time, we notice that it actually traces a sine function, which is one of the ingredients that all general functions are made up of. What this is telling us is that if you move along a circular path, then your position over time is actually a sine function or a cosine function, depending on how you look at it. Now, I don't know about you all, but I think this is really cool. And what it's telling us is that instead of thinking about general functions as being made up of trigonometric functions, we can think about them as being made of circular paths like this one. This is what the sum of the three trigonometric functions looks like when each of the three trigonometric functions is viewed as a circular path. We notice that all the circular paths have different sizes and different speed of rotations. And these depend on the amplitude and frequency of the trigonometric functions that they each represent. Now, to get the sum of trigonometric functions using circular paths like this one, we arrange them such that the center point of each subsequent circle is at the terminal point of the previous circle's rotating phasor. Circular paths that are arranged in this way are called epicycles. So this is an epicycle sum of trigonometric functions. With that understanding in mind, let us get back to our idea of this mathematical unsmoothing machine that can break functions into their sine and cosine functions, or epicycle components. It turns out that mathematicians have already discovered an equation for this machine, and they called it the Fourier transform. This is the equation of the Fourier transform. But we are not going to be working with this equation today. Instead, we'll be looking at a variant of the Fourier transform equation, which is called the discrete Fourier transform. And this is what the equation of the discrete Fourier transform looks like. I'm pretty sure that for most of you, this now looks more complicated than the previous Fourier transform equation that we just saw. But I can assure you that this version of the Fourier transform is actually way simpler to understand and to translate into code. All that we need to do is first understand the meaning of each symbol, variable, and subscript that makes up this equation. And when we do that, we'll be able to translate it into code. The symbol that looks like a weird capital letter E is called the summation symbol. And whenever you see the summation symbol, you must immediately know that you're going to have to implement some kind of a loop in your code. The equation n is equal to 0 below the summation symbol is our summation starting point. And it also defines the point at which we start our loop iteration. The expression capital N minus 1 above the summation symbol is the summation endpoint, and that defines the point at which we stop our loop iteration. The expression to the right of the summation symbol is what makes up the body of our loop. Small letter x is going to be the input to our Fourier transform machine. So in our case, that is going to be some list of image coordinates. And then subscript n just means the nth item in that input list. So in our case, it's going to be some nth image point. Capital letter X is the output that comes out of our Fourier transform machine. So in our case, this is going to be some list of phasors or epicycle components or trigonometric functions, depending on whichever abstraction you want to use. Because with all of those, you know that they can be translated into one another. And the one thing that I want you to notice from this equation, before we actually get down to seeing how we translate into code, is that we need to sum through all our image points or all of our input points to get a single output component. And what that is telling us is that there's probably going to have to be some nested loop involved so that we can actually get all of our output components. So let us get to our IDE and see how we translate all of this into some code. Well, we are not going to open our IDE, but this is what it is. The first thing that I do is I take in a list of coordinates that I brief an image. So this list of image coordinates makes up our general function. And the first thing that I do once I have that list of image coordinates is convert each of the image coordinates to a phasor, that is a rotating vector. But I set the frequency of rotation for each phasor to 0, which basically just makes it a static vector. And this is just a convenient abstraction for me because it's easier and more intuitive to perform vector arithmetic than to perform coordinate arithmetic or epicycle arithmetic or whatever other kind. So it's just a convenient abstraction, really. I also initialize our output list to also be a list of phasors for the same reasons that I just described now. It's convenient, it's easier to perform vector arithmetic. I also initialize our capital letter N to be the size of the input that we give to our mathematical unsmoothing machine, or the Fourier transform equation. And once all of that is done, that's when we get to our nested for loops, which we just talked about. And the first thing that I do at line 44 is I create this phasor object, which I call sum. And this is the object that's going to be accumulating all the results that we get from our inner loop. And we'll see that now in just a second. Once we have our sum phasor, we then notice from the discrete Fourier transform equation that we are simply just multiplying the nth image point by some difference of the cosine and sine of some common angle. So I first take out that common angle and I call it theta. That is what our theta is going to look like. It just depends on the current value of k and n. Once we have that angle, we also create this other phasor object, which I call multiplier. And this is the object that represents the difference of the cosine and sine function that I just talked about. So we have the x coordinate of that phasor being cos of theta, our common angle. We have its y coordinate being the sine of theta, again, our common angle. And once we have all of that, we get to line 49, which is the one that is actually the loop body that we talked about. It's just that I had to build all these sort of like abstractions above it to get to this line. But this is line 49, the body of the for loop, the discrete Fourier transform. And what it's doing is we take the nth image point, we multiply it by some difference of the cosine and sine, and then we just add all those to get a single phasor component. In our outer loop, that's when we accumulate all the values, and then we get the nth, the kth phasor component. Once we have all of that, we notice in line 51 that what I do is I take the x coordinate of the terminal point of our sum phasor and I divide it by capital N. And I do the same to the y coordinate of the terminal point. But the reasons for that are beyond the scope of this presentation. But I just want you to know that they actually allow you to get the exact same size image as the image you give it, instead of getting some largely scaled version of it. And then the last thing that I do at line 54, which has nothing to do with the Fourier transform itself, is I just sort out all the phasor components that are in my output list by magnitude. And this is just to make sure that the bigger epicycles are going to be generated first. And this is just to make our animation look more beautiful. It has nothing to do with the Fourier transform. Now, with all that understanding in mind, we can actually get to the IDE, run the program that is powered by this Fourier transform equation, and see what it's going to allow us to do. Okay. Okay. I think I can end this one now. And we get back to this one. Yes. So we can run this program. Let's we wait for it to do its thing, and we hope that it's gonna do it. And let's go back. Okay. We need to get the resolution right. Okay. And I think we are fine. So what I do is I have some preloaded images here to the left. Forgive the UI UX of this thing, but it works. Yes, it works. I have some preloaded images here, and the reason I have those is because I felt it was going to be quicker to actually do the demo for those. Because the first thing that I actually do after reading all those image coordinates is I have to sort them such that their order actually traces the image that we want to replicate back. Because if you don't do that, and you just read off those images using some loop or whatever, you are going to just get pixels that are not ordered in a way that traces your original image, right? So I perform some nearest neighbor sorting before I actually get to have those image coordinates in order. So these are the preloaded images that I have, and we can, I think Einstein. So we can select, for example, one of those that we want. And then the first thing that it does is it's going to generate these initial arrangements of the epicycles that are going to be used to trace the original image that we gave it. So that's what they look like. And then once you have that and you click the play button, you can see it start to animate the process of replicating the original image that we gave it. And yes, we just marvel at the beauty of it as it does its thing. And so we can obviously get back our image of Einstein, but I thought since I am coming to an iCode Java conference, I must also show some love to the conference itself. So we can also draw from images, for example, that we select. So let's go iCode Java somewhere over there. We have, I think, this one. So you can select an image, and it takes a bit of time to actually sort of like upload the entire thing, because in the background it's doing all those calculations that we talked about. Then once it's done, that's when it actually selects, like shows you the right combination of epicycles that are needed to draw that image. But looking at it now, I think I selected the wrong iCode Java icon. So I am going to have to change that. So okay,
Let's see. Nope, it's still we still have to show love to iCode Java, so we're gonna do it again. So we go select image and we go over here, iCode Java. Over there, and the original one. So we select that, and it should give us the right combination of epicycles that can be used to trace back that logo. So we do that, and like before, we click the play button, and we marvel at the beauty as it does its thing. So now we have actually come to the end of this presentation. And I just want to say that when I first got this program to draw images like this, I was so excited. I wanted to share it with everyone. And it is that excitement that got me to sign up for a talk at this conference. But a few weeks of preparations down the line, that's when the reality hit me, that I'm actually trying to give a 40-minute talk about maths. And the idea just got crazier and crazier with time. And I don't know how many times I actually thought about quitting. But I'm glad I didn't. So it is my hope that after listening and watching all of this, you have at least developed some liking and curiosity of mathematics, enough to earn it a date, I hope. I hope that after you leave this place, you won't be scared to explore ideas and concepts out there, simply because they sound too complicated or scary to try out. Try to understand the meaning of the words that are used to describe concepts. Try and understand them from a different perspective. And keep learning, don't settle. Whatever that you do, keep learning and don't settle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
So if you wanted to, it's such fun. So if you wanted to analyze an image, so that it's color, in other words, you accurately represent color.
Yes.
How would you change your approach? What would you add to what you've done?
So currently what I'm doing is, for all these images that I drew here,
I actually did some pre-processing on them to speed up the process, like make the background be white, and I just make like the image to be black and white. But at the point where I'm actually reading the actual image pixels, right, I actually have the color of the image itself. It's just that I don't make use of it at that point, but I do have it. It's something that I could just change it to make it draw the actual pixel color instead of using a default pen color that I chose. So yeah, it's a possible thing to do. Yeah, it does, because now the whole reason of making the background to be white is just I then say ignore all white pixels, right? So it brings it to a very small sample size that I work with. That will make it slow. And it's unfortunately one of the downsides of actually working with the Fourier transform, that algorithms with the Fourier transform are slow. So yeah.
Why did you choose to implement the discrete Fourier transform and not the arbitrary transform?
Because it was easier to explain how it goes from the actual equation to code. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Monish. Can we give him a huge round of applause? I felt like I was in Big Bang Theory. It was pretty awesome, pretty dope, man. Well done.
Thank you.
Guys,